Acolytes, welcome. The Legendary series from Slop News Network, and I'm calling it Legendary because, let's just be honest here, 1.3 million, 532 after the first day with 24k subs. He struck gold here, especially that the old videos didn't do as well. Now he's here. He's actually on the block. People know who he is. So he just made the right video at the right time in a correct way. I am so happy for him. I'm gonna be honest, Slop News Network, very happy for him. Good job. Perfect. Continue doing it like that. And let's just shade on Pirate Software a bit, won't we?
All right, let's start diving into the DRM analysis for Pirate Software's two games, Champions of Breakfast and Heartbound. Let's start with some information about the two games and clear up some misinfo too. Both Champions of Breakfast and Heartbound were created in the GameMaker engine. Champions of Breakfast is the game Jason claims has the unpiratable DRM.
I tried to find a way so that our game wouldn't get pirated because it'd be easy to pirate it. This is your save file. First start the game up, it actually checks what achievements you have and it unlocks powers based on your achievements. This is actually the save file for the character. So
How is it called? Champions of Breakfast. Let's see. Champions. Come on. Champions of Breakfast. Ooh, there is even a song thing. Nice. Good job here. So, what is this about? As I see it, nobody gives a fuck to pirate your game. So, yeah, it's not even available in my own region, so. But if the DLC got like 4 buys, yeah, nobody gives a fuck pirating your shit, so.
you can't pirate it because you can never use the achievements. It made it unpiratable, which is deeply hilarious.
So, as you saw, essentially the DRM for Champions of Breakfast is the Steam achievements acting as a quasi-save file. The Heartbound DRM is the following code snippet that Jason has shown live on stream multiple times. Now, recently, a lot of people have been posting that Heartbound has always online DRM. That is false. Heartbound does not have always online DRM. The DRM approach does not require online connectivity to function. It'll work just fine with Steam in offline mode. Jason has told the truth in regards to this matter, so he doesn't deserve the online DRM hate he's getting currently. Second, the Steam achievements acting as a save file is only in Champions of Breakfast. Heartbound does not have any dependence on Steam achievements. These are two completely separate DRM solutions. Now, let's start analyzing the Heartbound DRM code. The important variable we need to pay attention to within the code is on line 3, the global.pirated game variable that is set to 1. Like the variable name suggests, this is what dictates whether or not the game is considered pirated within the game itself. A value of 1 implies the variable has a truthy value. Normally for this type of thing, we'd use a boolean and use true and false as the variable values directly, but we'll leave that aside for now and touch on it again in the code review section. If we continue and move on to line 5, we can see the DRM process goes as follows. First, we check to see if Steam is initialized. Once if it's confirmed to be true, the game is considered legitimate, hence line 7. Then at line 13, we check to see if the Steam client is actually a Steam emulation or crack. The double equal sign means we're checking to see if the value of this function is equal to the ASCII string IGG Games. IGG Games is an unsafe piracy group, and they use their name when they package their cracked Steam games. Then we set the game to pirated on line 14 if we confirm it's an IGG Games cracked copy of the game. Now, we move on to line 16 where we check to see if there's a bogus account ID. We also, on line 19, check to see if we have a known Steam app ID that is commonly used in cracks or playing pirated games or mods. If either one of these checks end up being true, we also set the pirated game variable to true. Now, in order for us to break this DRM, the first two problems we have to deal with is the function call of Steam initialized and the Steam DRM that would be included with the actual game. Steam DRM is Steam's own added-on DRM. It is completely separate from the Heartbound DRM we're discussing. Due to legal reasons, I'm not going to directly show what programs to use or how to bypass Steam functions in Steam DRM, but we'll explain a bit about the process and how secure using Steam functions as a form of DRM is. First, let's talk about the Steam DRM.
I'm gonna be honest, I'm not a fan of this, even if it sounds good, Acolytes, but this gives Steam too much power. You literally cannot play your game. Basically cannot play your game if you're not on Steam. So that's something that I am not a fan of. Or, I mean, sometimes just playing offline without anything is just fun, and you just take the possibility of that entirely out. If you're a Steam gamer, well, that's not a problem. If you're not, then it's a problem. And I mean, cheating the achievements in, I think it wouldn't be that hard. I just don't... Maybe it is, maybe it's not. I'm not
Steam
sure.
DRM has been well understood by cracking groups for a very long time. It's so well understood and commonly cracked, there are multiple tool sets built for it and guides, to the point even non-technical users can use them to crack and distribute their own Steam games. This is called home rips, and this is one of the reasons there's so many Steam games that have day one cracks floating around. Next, we have...
If something's called Homer, it's probably extremely easy to do. Very easy to do.
the Steam functions that we saw in the Heartbound DRM code that we need to address for the Champions of Breakfast DRM. For this issue, let's talk about Steam client emulators. These are programs that mimic some legitimate Steam client functions and fake some of the other functionality you expect in the legitimate Steam client. There are numerous Steam client emulators, and I'm not going to touch any of these emulators, but take my word for it that they can easily get through the Steam DRM and the initialized function check, and they can also mimic the Steam Achievement API, meaning not only can the Steam DRM be bypassed by using these emulators, but they would also allow you to crack and play Champions of Breakfast, plus you'd basically have a save game editor along with the two. While we're on the topic of Champions of Breakfast, I was curious how long it took for the game with the unpiratable DRM to be cracked after it was released, and this is what I found. 1 day and 17 hours after the game was released on Steam, there was already a home rip floating around. If you don't consider home rips to be valid, I also checked to see if any known Where's scene groups had a crack for the game. The scene group Simplex has also had a crack for the game floating around for years at this point, so that unpiratable DRM has been soundly defeated multiple times just after launch. Now, with those problems addressed, let's return to the Heartbound DRM code and examine the last problem we need to figure out how to break. Namely, the IGG games check and the various ID checks setting the pirated game variable to true. In order to break this, we'll need to do some reverse engineering. To make this reverse engineering and cracking process smoother to explain, I've copied over this snippet of code into a tiny C.
I'm gonna be honest, he could have just stopped here and his point would be made. Right now he's just kicking a corpse. So basically, pirate software, impenetrable wall is shit. Yeah. Remember that eating thing he said? Yeah, he probably ate S while he did this, so...
C++ program. The DRM I have in it is in the left pane between lines 13 to 51. Now, you might notice I have a couple functions here between lines 15 to 33. Those are just placeholders. Due to legal reasons, I'm not including the real Steam SDK or functions in my tiny program, or including it within the actual reverse engineering process. Since I already explained how they can be defeated, it's not important to include them in the program. Back to our code, you can see the rest of the DRM matches up basically one-to-one with the DRM snippet we have from Heartbound. Last line to note, I run the DRM check here on line 108 just after the program starts. The rest of my program code doesn't matter too much. I'm basically just using the Windows native Win32 API to create a simple window that will have a red background if the game is pirated, and if it's a legitimate copy, the background will be green. Also, just like the Heartbound DRM code, we start the program assuming to be in a pirated state. Now, I compiled the little app we have, and we have an exe we can run. Let's pretend we don't have the actual source code and just have the exe. So, how do we modify this exe and beat the DRM? In order to modify this exe, we'll need to use what is known as a disassembler plus a debugger. I'll be using Ollie Debug, which is a very old and outdated x86 debugger. If someone was doing actual reverse engineering...
Holy shit, brother. Slower, please, for F's sake. This is... For somebody who doesn't do this stuff, this is pretty... Well, hard to follow. Just talk a bit slower, for F's sake.
These days, the tools they would look for and use would probably be something like EDA Pro or Ghidra, a reverse engineering tool built by the NSA and freely available on GitHub to download and use. Anyways, let's open up Ollie Debug and attach a little DRM test application and see what we get. So here in the main window, we have something that is called assembly. This is normally the lowest low-level programming language used and is very tightly corresponds to machine code. And these are the instructions your computer or phone CPU is actually executing when you're using a program. The other window panes don't matter at all for our purposes, so we can ignore them. Next, I'm going to run this program as just a simple smoke test to make sure everything's working as we expect it to. Namely, we see the red background and the pirate game detected stuff we expect from our DM. I don't need the live attached process info, so I'll close the app and return to the view we had originally when we opened the exe. Now, remember earlier how I mentioned IGG games was an ASCII string? Well, that's what we're going to search for. Since the string isn't obfuscated and will be in plain text, we can easily search for it and hunt it down. Alright, I see 2 IGG game strings in our search. Let's just go and open the first one and see what code is there. The first function looks similar to our stub function in our C++ code. The second IgG game strings is just a bit beneath, so let's look at that. Now we see something interesting, notably the D word pointer and the line ending with 0. If we look just a few more lines below, we see more D word pointer lines, except these ones end with 1. I hope everyone is catching on and you realize these are the lines of our original C++ source code setting the pirated game variable. Now, since we already know this is the DRM function, what happens if we change the values in those lines below to 0? With all that changed, let's try running our little application again, and we've successfully cracked the DRM, since now the pirated game variable at every point in our program code will always report back false.
What the F? What the F? This is actually so easy, or if you know what you're doing, of course, that's... But this entire thing, yeah, you could learn it pretty quick, I think. It's not that hard. And the uncrackable thing, yeah. As always, pirate software is full of shit, just as it is.
Now, I'm sure many of you watching have questions and concerns. Stuff like, what if Pirate never shared the DRM code? You wouldn't be able to do this so easily and quickly. Or maybe something like, your app was made in C++. Heartbound is made in GameMaker, so the output files and structure would be different. First, let's pretend we didn't know what the DRM code looked like and we're doing a real blind reverse engineering attempt at cracking the DRM. Let's go through this scenario. Let's assume we already have the original game files. Now we open the game, and let's say we're using one of those Steam client emulators I mentioned from earlier in the video. Let's say we're playing through Heartbound and trying to find information to use to actually crack it. Well, we're in luck. Since Heartbound has a piracy message, if you somehow manage to pull this exact scenario I'm describing, here's a screenshot from a user that owns a legitimate copy of the game, and they managed to trigger this pirate message on their Steam Deck, meaning two things. One, the DRM is so bad it has false positive activations, which I find funny, and two, we have our unique identifiable, mostly unobfuscated ASCII string to search for in our debugger. The pirate message string is unique enough that we can use it to hunt down the DRM code within the debugger. The reason being, in order for the message to appear, it has to either be checking the pirated game variable or is close to the DRM check function, because otherwise it wouldn't be able to be triggered. In either case, we have enough info from this alone to hunt down the DRM and break it, even if we didn't have the original DRM code snippet for reference. Now, let's talk about the C++ versus GameMaker issue. GameMaker is a game engine, and it has its own process of packaging up a game.
I'm gonna be honest, Acolytes, for the amount of bragging and showing how good he is, 20 years of experience, being one of the freaking best security thingy-bobs for pirate software. His code is so shit that you cannot even trust it to show the correct thing. So even if you bought the copy legitimately, you could still get this, and if you're unlucky because you think this is a bug or that you want a reward or something like that, the guy would then probably just make fun of you on his stream because he just assumed you pirated the copy. I don't know who the F at this point is a fan of his. I don't know. I don't know why. Somebody that scams you this freaking hard. If you're still a fan of pirate software, then sorry, you're just a moron. At this point, why? It's so obvious that this guy is a scammer. Why are you still a fan of him? It just doesn't make sense to me. Logan Paul is a scammer and people still watch him, so I guess that's the same thing here. It's just
built together and will include much more files than just a single exe. You might think this would make the cracking process more difficult, but the exact opposite is actually true. The reason is GameMaker builds are something that is well understood, and there are lots of decompilation tools. You might remember me using the term compilation earlier in the video, so let me explain these two terms a bit more clearly now. When you have, for example, our C++ source code and you're trying to turn it into an executable the computer can run, this is called compilation, the process of turning code into instructions the computer can actually understand and can execute. Decompilation is the process in reverse. You have some kind of application and you're trying to convert it back into what the original source code looked like, meaning you can use a decomp tool on the GameMaker build and get back GameMaker language code that it looks somewhat close to the original source code, which also means you'd have an easier time hunting down the DRM code since it's easier to reason about in a GameMaker language than it is in raw assembly. So the C++ reverse engineering example I demonstrated is actually harder and more worst case scenario, relatively speaking, to trying and figure out the crack. Now, to the last question everyone might have, what if that pirated game variable didn't exist and you couldn't change the value to 0? Well, nothing changes even if that was the case. Why? Well, the DRM is so stupidly simple and there isn't any application security measures to prevent reverse engineering or tampering with it. We could have just ripped out the entire DRM function and left it empty. We could have found the places the DRM checks were called and removed them instead. Regardless of what we chose, there's at least a few dozen working options to pick from. And all of this also applies to the actual Heartbound game, not just to the tiny C++ program I wrote. To be thorough, I'll also cover some application security measures that could be added and some DRM measures, but I'll keep it light and just at a high level overview since diving into those is way too out of scope for this video. First of all, let's go back to our C++ source code. Something we could add to prevent Ollie debug from opening up our exe would be to add the native Win32 function isDebugger present. Yes, that one line would help stop some of the simplest debuggers from opening the exe. Next, we could also add something called string obfuscation, meaning we don't need stuff like IGG games or the YAR pirate message and easy to search for format. By obfuscating and having a special function to decode the real strings, we could have prevented the search string stuff we did in the cracking process.
I'm gonna be honest, for F's sake, Shadow Master, I know you're watching. If you do your game, for fuck's sake, make it better than this bollocks. Honestly. What the F? It's just so... The amount of breaking that pirate software does is just unbelievable. For something that, as I understand it now, is so shit that basically everybody, even if I'm gonna try it afterwards, if I can actually do this. Just gonna be honest here. Of course I won't wink wink nudge nudge, but it's just, why?
Process.
Why?
Another simple thing we could do is what's called a checksum. Basically, we can have our own application look at part of itself and generate a special result from that. So in the case if someone tried to crack the application by removing the DRM, the application portion being checked would be different, meaning the checksum generated now would be different from what's expected and as a result would fail. These are fairly common additional layers of defense for programs to help prevent tampering with the distributed program by end users. Alright, with all that, I think we can start wrapping up this DRM analysis. And yes, there's a million more things that could have been done, and yes, there's a ton more application security measures that could be added. There's entire standard bodies around it. I just barely scratched the surface. Also, I'm not a hacker. I don't do this type of work professionally, and I don't mess around with this stuff in my free time either. I'm a complete novice when it comes to this area. But for context, if I didn't stop this video every few seconds to explain what was going on, the first attempt I took at cracking the DRM in total, uninterrupted, would have been 37 seconds altogether. Now,
okay, let's be fair. He probably knows his stuff a bit more than somebody who's at zero like me, but hey.
let's return to Jason and see a tweet plus a short where he mentions his assembly and reverse engineering experience.
I'm a hacker. I've been a hacker for 20 years. Part of my job throughout that was working in the games industry. I was one of the guys sitting there pulling down every bot that worked for every MMO that we worked on, everything at Blizzard, grabbed every single one of those, pulled it out into assembly, grabbed the code cave from it, removed the polymorphic.
The section is pretty long, so we'll save breaking down the code cave and polymorphic code comments and nonsense, and his comments to VX Underground for maybe a part 3 video related to his hacking claims. The only part from here we need to care about for now is Jason has confirmed to have done reverse engineering and gone through and read assembly, similar to what we did earlier. That was another reason I chose to use C++ and Ollie debug, since those would have been the language and tool he would have been using during his time period at Blizzard or earlier, since those were some common choices back then. Now, while in part 1 I leaned towards distrust, but I gave him the benefit of doubt on a few of his hacking points, I think it's clear to see Jason doesn't seem to know a whole lot on how to create a secure application or how to set up a real custom DRM solution. And while this entire video I've been referring to all this as DRM, it really doesn't deserve to be called as such. I can fairly confidently say Jason barely has any application hacking knowledge that you would expect someone to have with his supposed history and experience. So the fact he doesn't even seem to understand any of these concepts or problems makes me fairly confident saying his reverse engineering and assembly claims are mostly made up stories or complete and outright lies. Let's leave the DRM stuff behind us now and move towards the code reviews. Before I start doing the reviews themselves, let me give some additional context. If you watched part 1, you would know Jason supposedly started doing dev stuff in 2002, meaning at this point in 2025, he has 23 years of experience programming. When he started working on his first game, Champions of Breakfast, he had somewhere around 13 years of experience. So when he started seriously working on Heartbound, he should have been very familiar with GameMaker and the GameMaker language. Also, he's the owner of the game studio and the only person who's ever touched the code on the Heartbound game.
Yeah, the thing is, the code on the Heartbound thing, I don't believe even for a second, because he has people who work for him. And no, I just, as I said, Acolytes, I am not watching at this as a professional, but this claim, in my opinion, is, I know how it is to be somebody who actually has workers under him, if you give them something to work, they automatically have to touch things that they are doing. And I cannot, for the life of me, maybe that's ignorance, but I cannot believe that none of the workers ever touched his code. That's total bollocks.
I don't want to hear any nonsense like his code's bad on purpose for job security or someone else wrote the garbage code and he inherited and has to maintain it. Lastly, all the code we're going to look at is modern and should still be in the game based on what I could find from his live streams. So this is a reflection of his current abilities. I'll be saving all my comments related to Jason's coding abilities for after I finish all the code reviews. Also, let me break down my criteria and rules I set for myself so everyone understands why I chose these code snippets and how I'll be offering advice and comments on them. First off, the code snippet had to be something I had confirmed to be shown on Jason's streams. I had a ton of people sending me code snippets in text over the last few days. So while it might be Jason's code, if I couldn't confirm it, I decided to skip it for the sake of fairness. So every code snippet we'll review today is something I can personally verify has been shown on one of his streams and is legitimate Heartbound code. Second off, the code needs to be a reoccurring problem or have significant impact on a large part of the code base. So I won't be reviewing some throwaway script on some small unimportant object, like some random tree object that has an attached script. This I think is kind of pointless to review, so I skip those kind of super low hanging fruits. Thirdly, unless I absolutely have to, I won't drastically change the code. I'll offer solutions and improvement paths that can be taken to make the current code reach some junior level baseline of quality. Also, I'll limit my advice to things that are possible in the game maker language and engine. So design patterns and practices that are possible in other engines or languages, but not easily doable or possible in game maker, I'll be skipping. Fourth, I largely won't be talking about performance. We're just trying to get the code to something readable that a real development team could realistically understand and work on. Having performance discussion and talking about entirely different data structures and game design patterns is too far removed from the topics of this video. Plus, the Heartbound game is extremely simple, so additional improvements here won't truly matter. Fifth, if I basically covered all the issues another code snippet would have, I won't cover the other similar snippets. Basically, there are like 100 files with the exact same problems and issues, so if I address the issues other code snippets would have during the other snippet reviews, I'll skip over anything too similar so this video isn't stupidly long and repetitive. Yes, there's that many problems with the code base, I felt I needed to add these rules and criteria. With all that out of the way, let's start with some actual code reviews. We'll bring back the DRM snippet and we'll open up a few other snippets as well. If you remember at the start of the video, I talked about truthy and falsy values on the pirated game variable, and I brought up the term booleans. Booleans are a basic data type in nearly all programming languages, and you would use the values of true and false directly when you're checking to see if a variable is, well, true or false. So if we look at these code snippets, we can see Jason is using 0 or 1 in numerous places, instead of using the appropriate data types and values. This is a sign of a more amateur programmer. I just wanted to clear this up now, so we won't have to repeat this in every single code snippet we look at. Now, let's drill down into a specific code snippet. We'll start with the one from the bottom left. Alright, so the very first line, we already have a lot of issues here. So Jason is accessing a storyline flag in a single dimensional global array using a raw index number of 367. Both of those things are terrible, but let me explain what an array is first. Arrays are a basic data structure that stores a collection of elements. Let's go through a quick example. Imagine you have a row of boxes, and inside each box you add the number. To access a number inside a specific box, you would use what's called an index value. In GameMaker, array indexes start at 0. Another nice thing with arrays, there are lots of functions built into your programming language, making it much nicer to work with. Arrays are a basic program concept and near universal in all languages. Now, let's deal with the index number 367. This is what we call a magic number. Magic numbers in programming are when you use a number directly to check or access something, and there's no way for someone reading it to have any idea what it could possibly mean or refer to without someone else explaining the intent or finding a different file that might hold the context needed. Jason uses magic numbers across all his files in codebase. So for us to get context on this, let's pull up another code snippet that has the storyline, array comments, and logic. Okay, there's another huge...
Damn, this is so much information. What the fuck is this bollocks? I mean, the thing is, as I see it, as it's explained, this guy has no fucking idea what he's doing for the most part. It's insane. I mean, at this point, Pirate Software is a lol cow. It's just, what the F? Okay, maybe I'm overdoing this, maybe, but Pirate Software, it sounds like he's not on a professional level, he's on a very, very beginner level and thinks that he's hot shit for some reason. Just because he programmed like 2 shitty games. And yes, I'm calling them 2 shitty games because he needs years, or he released one, I don't know how long he needed for freaking food battle thing. Okay, fair enough. Let's just do it. Okay. And the second one is an early access for 7 years for a game that other creators, Solo by the way, released in 2. What the fuck, honestly?
Just you with this code snippet too. Something I'll refer to as code change blast radius. To better understand what blast radius is, let's imagine we're looking at lines with indexes of 207 and 208, dealing with something called middle storyline flags. Let's say one day we want to add another storyline flag or event for this section called middle. We have 2 options here. Option 1, we go to the end of this array and add in a completely unrelated area of the array, another middle event. So this array has something like 560 indexes, meaning if we added a new one at the end, our middle event flags would be indexes 207, 208, and 561. This is absolutely terrible since logic events that should be together are at completely random spots inside the array. This causes a whole host of issues. The code becomes difficult to reason about, the magic numbers become even more challenging to maintain and use. It's so obtuse that the odds of maintaining and using this code decreases the more this array is expanded on. So what's option 2? Well, it would be nicer if it was at line 209. So it's logically grouped together, but in order to do that, we need to bump all the other indexes by 1. So the old 209 would be 210, old 210 would be 211, etc. Unfortunately, this is what we call a nightmare code change or refactor scenario. Since if we wanted to do that, we would have to go by hand and update every single index after 209 within this file. Then we'd have a near 100% code change blast radius. Since if we change those indexes, every other file using those storyline flags is going to need to update their index number by 1 if they're at the 209th index or greater. Essentially, the structure is so bad and unwieldy, it's basically impossible to maintain or extend in a good way as it is. Let's deal with the magic numbers first, then we'll discuss a better way to do the story flags. We have 2 options when it comes to the magic index numbers. We can use const values or enums. Const values are just a named variable with a value that will never change. Enums are a data type that contains its own list.
By the way, extremely good thing that he explains the things instantly. That's good. That's good.
Of named constants. Enums are a much nicer choice to work with, so we'll go with them. With this enum defined, we can update the global storyline array where index 207 and 208 are with the enum values. Now, isn't this better? Now we have some context for what the storyline array index is for. Plus, if we return to our previous code snippet, we could change all these magic numbers into enum values. So 367 could be an enum forest value, 333 could be an enum value for a town, and the 1 and 2 that is Fern and Road could also use a character enum. Now we have our first code improvement. The storyline flag structure still isn't good, but we've reduced the blast radius of changes from the entire codebase to basically just one file. Since we have a nice abstraction away from the raw index number, we just need to update the enum and the storyline array to have new flag options without having to update the rest of the codebase. This also helps with something called developer experience, DX for short. GameMaker includes what we call an IDE, or integrated development environment. Basically, an IDE helps you to code and easily refer to code and values across your codebase. So if we use, let's say, the enum example, and we started typing in middle and then dot, the IDE would show us the values under the middle enum, meaning we don't have to search for the file with the enum to see what values we can use under that specific enum. We also don't get a bunch of random type suggestions that don't apply to this situation. Having good DX is important when working in a team, and I'd argue critical if you're trying to build and program something solo in a reasonable amount of time. So we'll stop worrying about the snippet since it's half decent code quality now and workable. Now, let's return to the global storyline array. While our enum change is a huge improvement over the original state of this file, this still isn't exactly good. Now, before I offer...
Okay. I hope you actually hear the digs that he does to Pirate Software, like from time to time, just like little, yeah, and then this, and, you know, and just little steps.
For a solution, let's see why Jason used the flat single dimensional array in the first place. So according to Jason, he has a flat array because he wants all the values to be saved exactly the same way in the game's save file so players can modify it. Well, his reasoning is kind of dumb. What kind of code structure you have and the save file format you want do not impact each other. Every single game that has a save file has something called serialization, which is the process of taking your game structure and data and converting it into a format your game will know how to read and reassign the values into the correct places. This is serialization and deserialization respectively, and it's a basic concept when making a save file. This is literally a basic thing nearly every single game has. So yes, it's perfectly safe to not use the one to...
But if you sell it correctly, like Pirate Software did, it sounds pretty, well, awesome for people that don't know what the F they are actually talking about. So yes, I can see that Pirate Software is very good in social engineering. Extremely good. Because selling something like this is something actually, well, high level, without saying it, well, there's a certain mastery of the English language. You actually need to do that.
dimensional array here. Next, let's look at his save file. So every line has a random number value that's supposed to correspond to one of his array indexes. Since we know what the problem is and what we need to achieve, now let's actually code up a better solution. Let's start by changing the storyline array into a struct. A struct is a composite data type. Basically, it's just a variable that can hold other variables inside itself. Since we already know Heartbound has 5 chapters, I'll further split up the structs for the 5 chapters to have some separation of concerns. Here we can see what the structs look like. We have at the top level our chapter, then we have our area of that chapter, and finally within the 3rd level we have our storyline event. What's so nice with this approach is, we can now ditch the enums entirely. We can access the storyline flags like this, for example, chapter 1, middle, Joe sunglasses. Not only is this incredibly clear on what value we're trying to access, but now we also have nearly no code change blast radius if we want to modify a flag or add a new one. The setup also makes it safer if we're working in a team, since now if any changes are made to any of these structs, you wouldn't cause cascading issues to the rest of the flags, as was the case with the raw index usage. While this is nicer to use, this isn't the only benefit. In GameMaker, it's incredibly easy to iterate through a struct. So what we can do for the save game logic is the following. We can take our struct, go through the key value pair, and since we know the depth level, we can nicely format the save file to include the chapter, the section, and the story flags. For example, here we can clearly see which flag is for Joe's sunglasses. Another huge benefit using these key values directly from the struct is, we added some freedom to make refactors and code changes possible. Since we have the struct key inside the save file for the flag, in the future, if we wanted to change our code order of flags or add new ones, the struct of the save file wouldn't matter. We'd still be able to easily read in the right values. I think this is an important thing to care about. Since the game Heartbound is still in early access, the odds of changes occurring to the various parts of the game are high. And with this save file approach, we're basically in the clear to be as wild with our code changes as we want, and still ensure every player that is keeping up with the game updates is never negatively impacted by them. Also, one other minor thing, I threw in the save file or version number at the top for example. This helps ensure if we're making drastic changes between game versions, you can easily check what version of the save file you have and internally how to update it. Basically, it's just a good practice to ensure players aren't impacted by the behind the scenes work and progress on the game. With this
This is so beautifully yes, small things like that just impact everything. This is just extra information, and this, by the way, applies to everything in life. Small extra information makes the work easier. No matter where you're working, what you're working at, no matter what happens, if you have small snippets of extra information that just guide you to the right direction or give you like a smidge of information that could impact that or that has a small impact, just it has a freaking sense in it and just gives everyone a little extra, well, it just takes out the guesswork. And this then actually saves time. Save time is less stress and more work done. Perfect. Things like this, yes. But of course, I mean, didn't Pirate Software actually say that he is the king of time management at some point? Yeah, I don't see it. If you let this out, no.
This solution done, let's now look at the code comments from the original snippet. With their structure and clarity, we can start cutting out large portions of these comments. We could keep the value conditions since that seems fine. While on the topic of comments, let's pull up some of the other snippets again. The comment frequency is way too high in Jason's code. Code should be self-documenting. Comments are perfectly fine to add if there's some special conditions or some other oddity surrounding the code usage, but some of these code comments are just worthless. For example, here he comments what the function call is going to do. There's no surrounding code inside the brackets to affect the function, and there's no parameters. If this needs a comment to understand what it's going to do, that means you should be renaming your function, not adding a comment. Also, redundancy like question asked equals 1 and set stuff is just wasting screen space. Maybe Jason was adding this for his live viewers so they would have a reference what he was coding, but leaving this in afterwards I find questionable. Moving on to the next snippet, we have another array to look at, where Jason is manually setting each array element to mostly the same value. First of all, manually setting every single array index for hundreds of arrays is something I've never even seen an amateur developer do. It's also problematic in a few ways. Either the array should be initialized with values directly, then modified by using the right functions, or we should be using a for loop iterating over the length of an existing array and ensuring every index has a valid value if we're completely modifying it to something else. Let's make our code change first, then I'll break it down. So what I did here was I added what is called the for loop. What this loop is doing is I will start at the 0 index of our array, check to see if our current index value is less than the total number of indices in our array, then it'll execute the lines inside the brackets, in our case assign a value to the current index. Finally, it will increase our current index number and check the loop conditions again. If the condition is still true, it will keep executing the code within the brackets until either the condition condition isn't true, or we explicitly break out of the loop. Then after we finish with this loop, we manually assign the 2 special index cases with the angry road voice value. Loops are another basic concept of programming. Now, why is this better? Well, for one thing, if we ever change the size of the array code in the future, this code will still be safe, since the array length index will know the exact right size of the array. Also, not having to write a million lines of redundant code is nice too. Second, this is actually much safer and will reduce the likelihood of runtime errors, or what you as a player would know as a game crash. So what are runtime errors? Let's say we have another place in code trying to use the voice list. And let's say Jason thought he had 27 elements in his voice array instead of 26. And he was once again using his magic numbers to try and access index 27 of the road talk voice list. If we look at the original array list, it only goes up to array index 26. So what happens when you try to access an index that doesn't exist? Well, the game is going to crash. That's what's going to happen. This happens because accessing an array index is in code GameMaker can verify ahead of time. So what happens is GameMaker will launch the game and execute the code up to that point. Once it hits the invalid index, the program will crash, since only at that point in time will it know the array index is invalid and there's no data there to access. Using our approach and the array functions, we can guarantee the full length of the array is accounted for and has values. We could also use the array last function too for the last valid index of an array. This doesn't guarantee the right character voice or expression will be used, but I still think it's preferable to have the wrong voice sound activated while the game is playing, instead of having the game crashing and the player losing who knows how much time or progress. Again, for loops and default initialization are very beginner level concepts and near universal in all programming languages. Alright, last snippet we're going to look at for this video. Here we have a gigantic switch statement with multiple repeating cases, and the total case amount being like 1,000 cases for one possible branch path. There's a second branch path where there's like another 100 switch cases inside it too. I think Jason might be trolling us with this one. Let's start with a simple improvement for the multiple cases that are exactly the same code. Normally, when you have a constantly repeating code, you write a function to call it to reduce code duplication and to reduce the possibility of incorrectly copying code and introducing bugs into your program. So if we create a function to reduce the amount of repetition we do, there's a lot of benefits. First, it's a lot easier to read and manage the code and the various cases. Second, it reduces the possibility of doing something incorrectly, especially when you're doing the same step hundreds of times. Again, better developer experience too. If you have common behaviors in a function, you don't need to manually type out the steps for every common dialogue behavior. It also speeds up development. Since Heartbound is a primarily story-driven game, the more of these common functions you have, the faster you can make cutscenes and dialogue scripts. Now, how do we improve the 1000 switch case? Well, I thought about this for a while, and I think the fastest way to improve it is we take it and we throw it in the trash and never look at it again. I generally thought about this for quite a while. There's essentially no improving the structure. For most of these code reviews, I tried to never recommend anything too far removed from the current state of things. But this is generally such horrifically architected code, there's basically no real way to improve it without a complete rewrite of things. Generally, when working with dialogue or complex cutscenes, you'd be using a lot more things than just the raw strings themselves. An array of dialogue structs for the lines would be a fairly common approach, and we could skim through a quick example. So the struct data is pretty dependent on your game and needs, but a few things are fairly common across most games, like having the line itself, the character you want to show on screen, and a dialogue type. Generally, we'll have the event type dictate how to proceed. So a more simple example could be something like the following scenario. Here we have the dialogue array filled with structs, and each dialogue line is a struct in itself, and it tells us exactly what kind of dialogue event it is and what choices and actions are possible for it. This reduces our switch statement to a handful of cases depending on how many event types we end up having. Secondly, it provides a very solid and reliable structure for us to use for all the cutscenes and dialogues within the game. Also, variables in GameMaker could point to other scripts. So let's say we needed to do something crazy that requires an escape hatch. Well, that's also incredibly simple, since in GameMaker we could set the value of the dialogue struct to another script and call it with script execute. With this, we have reduced over 1,000 dialogue cases into a handful that are easy to reason about and extend. Since this—
Damn. Yeah, just cut the fat off. Fuck yeah. This is so damn. Lovely. I'm gonna be honest, this is lovely. Okay.
This is a separate example. I'm not going to dive into this anymore. Okay, with all that out of the way, I think we can start closing up the code review, and I can start going over my comments. First off, yes.
Wait, I just seen this. The comments, almost done. Hang in there. Make from Slop News. Character, make from Slop News. Line, just 2 more code examples. Character, make from Slop News. Line, I do not have the strength to keep going with this code review anymore. Character, make from Slop News. Choice, skip this section to save your sanity, power through it, like and subscribe. I love this. And by the way, just show him some love. I mean, he already freaking got enough love, but still. The likes, subs, stuff, you know, the shebang. And by the way, you should actually say it in the video. It blinks up then.
Over my comments. First off, yes, there's a lot more things wrong with the code I've shown from Jason that I didn't talk about. There are way too many things to nitpick, so I try to limit my comments to the biggest issues. I also try to avoid offering changes or advice that is too far detached from his current structure and setup. That's why I didn't run through multiple solutions. Also, I didn't talk about any actual game design patterns, since that would be another video into itself, and he wasn't actually using any inside his code. Next, during the code reviews, I wasn't explaining any special concepts or anything. All of the Boolean stuff, the for loops, the safe default initialization, using functions with parameters, enums or const stuff, all of that is literally intro level program concepts. There was at no point in the code reviews where I went above a junior level developer's expected knowledge. Well, except maybe the struct iteration and the save file stuff. To help put this in perspective, let's pull up the Stanford CS 106A intro to...
So I was correct, by the way. It's like a beginner, just even worse. So, okay, I was incorrect. It's even worse. Damn.
Programming course. This is a first year, first semester type of course. It's incredibly similar to the one I took during my first year of college. And let's just look at the things you learn in. Basically, everything I discussed in this video is stuff you learn in this intro level course. The fact Jason doesn't even seem to have a good understanding or know about some of these things is just baffling. If we consider his 2002 LinkedIn start date as when he started learning about programming, that means as of today in 2025, he has 23 years of experience programming. Yet somehow, he doesn't even seem to understand the most basic entry level concepts in programming. It doesn't matter what programming languages you use or learn. These concepts like loops and booleans are essentially universal in nearly all languages. Now, someone might argue he doesn't have 20 years of game maker experience. I don't think that's a valid argument, but let's go through it anyways. His first release game was Champions of Breakfast, and he spent roughly 8 to 9 months on it. So for Heartbound, he should have had a pretty good understanding of things. If I wasn't making this video, I probably never would have touched Game Maker in my entire life. The entire time it took me to grasp the Game Maker language and write the code you saw in this video was roughly 2.5 hours. So I'm not giving Jason any passes due to a lack of experience with Game Maker. Now,
okay, yeah, Pirate Software is so cooked here. It's just not even, it's not even funny. Come the fuck on. If you can learn something in 2.5 hours, like this guy just says, and I believe him, by the way, because we know that Pirate Software, he's a known liar by now, so we know that. We also know that he has a problem with his ego, so he would never admit it. And this guy just shown freaking, and benefit of the doubt, by the way, here in this case, Slop News just shown receipt after receipt after receipt after receipt. What that he more or less knows what he's talking about. So I think that's fine then. We can believe him.
I avoided trash talking his code too much during the reviews, but let me pull up that mega switch statement again. Let me also pull up some Yandere dev code. Now, I know everyone trash talks Yandere dev's code, but it's easy to see how and why he made this. He had zero previous game dev experience or programming experience, and he dived headfirst into Unity. He just took the first thing he learned and he ran with it for every problem. The code isn't good by any means, but you can understand why it's like that. With Jason, I'm just left so confused, like, he's supposed to be a game dev industry veteran, and yet he's making stuff as bad as a complete amateur like Yandere dev. I also spent some time after finishing up this portion of the video, thinking back to all the code reviews I've done in all my previous jobs. I've easily done somewhere in the thousands of various code reviews, and I've reviewed code from all sorts of experience levels, from senior software architects to people having done a 4-month bootcamp and having less than half a year's of experience. And yet, I don't think I've ever reviewed anyone's code that was this bad. I'm not being hyperbolic when I say this, but this is genuinely some of the worst code I've ever reviewed, and I didn't even explain or dive into every possible issue with it. Plus, if we remember all of Jason's hacking claims, guess what? You need to know these basic programming concepts if you want to do reverse engineering or malware analysis. This is the foundation nearly everything else builds off of. Taking all that into account, I think Jason has been lying through his teeth about all his coding abilities, all his assembly stories, and just making stuff up with terms he's heard thrown around. If I was working with Jason and I saw this type of code being repeatedly submitted, I would push for him to be fired, with my state of reason being gross incompetence.
So, gross incompetence. There you got it. What the fuck, man? Yeah, but this is the thing. Jason or Pirate Software knows how to sell himself, or how to sell an idea in a perfectly manageable way. That's his strong suit. He may not know shit about the entire other thing, but he knows how to freaking sell himself. So, that's why it works. Just because he's confident, and I'm gonna be honest right now, I even start to believe that that's not even his voice, that he's using a voice over make thing. just so he sounds, well, a bit more manlier, I guess. I don't even know why people would change their voice. If you have a voice, it is what it is. Just own it and be a man. But hey, as it is, acolytes, good night.